Thank you for coming. I started writing this book well before the beginning of the full-scale aggression against Ukraine. That was summer 2021. That was the moment when I started thinking that Ukraine, as I told you that time, was some kind of phenomena, and I had to write a book about that. And that was the moment when I traveled a lot to Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, when I interviewed for the first time Zelensky and a lot of people from Ukrainian government, journalists. But obviously, everything how I saw that book in summer, in the fall of 2021, was completely forgotten when the full-scale aggression started. So on the day of February 24th, I had to recreate. I had to create the book again from the scratch because my approach has changed completely, and I started thinking about completely different book, and I started thinking that I had been wrong in my approach towards Ukraine before that, and everything, almost everything I was writing, I was thinking, a lot of my arguments in my different conversations with my Ukrainian friends were wrong. So it seemed like that that was some kind of wake-up call for me, and I realized that most of us, most of Russian journalists, Russian authors, we were like blind, and we did not pay attention to the any other historical narrative but the traditional Russian imperialist narrative, and we have never known any other version of Russian history except for the propagandist imperialist narrative that had been created by classical Russian historians. I started thinking about that different approach to Russian history that was possible. I started thinking that, unfortunately, most of classical Russian historians, whom we know, whom we read, who created the traditional Russian imperialist narrative, they, in a way, and forgive me for that word, in the way they were propagandists. They were working directly for the state. For example, Nikolai Ramzin was official historiographer of Emperor Alexander I, and like their work was designed to prove that all peoples of Russia, all ethnicities that lived in Russian Empire, all of the centuries of their history were dedicated only to that moment when they finally became the obedient servants of Great Russian Emperor. And we have never had any history of Russian people, and we have never had any history of peoples that lived in Russian Empire, peoples that were occupied by Russian Empire. And so actually, when I started thinking of that, when I started analyzing traditional approach to Russian imperialist history and necessity to try to create another narrative, that was the moment when I started writing this book. And actually, I started with the phrase that, to my mind, I am guilty for not understanding that before. And it's a very popular question. It's that has been discussed by Russians, Ukrainians. The question of collective guilt or collective responsibility. In this book, I started this book with my words about my personal responsibility, my personal guilt. I don't know anything about collective formats, but I know for sure about me. I think that I am guilty and I am responsible for not understanding a lot of things, for not reading the science, for not being careful to those words and to those arguments of my Ukrainian friends. I've been hearing for many years. I think many of us, Russian authors, Russian intellectuals, are really responsible for not paying attention to the stories of other nations, stories of other peoples who lived in Russia. We were okay with the history of great Russian Empire. We were okay with Moscow-centered, focused on Moscow and St. Petersburg, Moscow-centered version of Russian history, and we didn't pay attention to the histories of Ukrainian people, Belarusian people, Tatar people, Buryat people, all of them. We never paid attention to their pains, and we have never tried to write other historical narratives. And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we started, when Russian authors, Russian historians started testing another approach, the only other approach was exploring crimes of Lenin and Stalin, crimes of the Soviet Union. We have never questioned the idea of Great Russian Empire. We have never gone that far, because questioning the idea of Great Russian Empire and its crimes would undermine probably the idea of current Russian Federation. I decided to write that book about history of Russia, of Russian Empire addressing Ukraine. I'm a Russian author. I have no moral right to write history of Ukraine, and there are a lot of great Ukrainian historians who have written a lot of brilliant books about that. But I think it's very important for Russian audience, not only for Russian audience, to try to make that research and to try to think about Russian history as the history of the present. I think that it's the beginning of a very long conversation, and it's the beginning of decades-long conversation inside Russian society. I think that this book is going to be very painful. I hope so, that it's going to be painful for many people, for Russian liberals who live abroad, who left Russia after the beginning of full-scale invasion. And probably it's going to be very hard to read and to absorb for many people who live in Russia. Even now, we know that for many Russian historians, the phrase colonial Russian Empire seems to be inappropriate. And we all have heard many times that no, Russia was not is not a colonial empire. It's ridiculous, but even President Putin recently during the All-Night Forum made a huge speech about decolonialism and about his desire to fight against colonialism. And then he mentioned that, of course, Russia was not a colonial empire. All the nations always asked Russia to own that. They voluntarily joined Russia. We have always helped everyone. We never suppressed everyone. Yeah, that's very funny, but that's something that a lot of people truly believe. That's something that was written in all Russian history textbooks. That's something that a lot of Russian people have no doubts. And I guess that even Putin truly believes in that myth. And a lot of myths that our history consists of, they are very natural. We believe in our historical myths. So the first part of this book is first part consists of 7 chapters, and these are the 7 most important historical myths, or I consider them to be crucially important, because these myths are affecting today's psychology of Russian people. They still affect the decisions made by politicians, and we see that they are still being used by Russian politicians, by President Putin, as justification of current Russian policy. I won't speak for a long time about all those myths. Just I'll mention them. First chapter is about so-called reunification of Russia and Ukraine, about Yaroslavl Rada and Bogdan Khmelnytsky. The second chapter is about the mythical betrayal of Ukrainian nation, about Hetman Mazepa as a symbol of Ukrainians who tend to betray Russians. The third chapter is about Catherine the Great, Catherine II, who invaded and how they say made Russia made Crimea Russian and made Novorossiya Russian, and at the same time brought serfdom to Ukraine. The fourth chapter is about myth of Ukrainian language, or about non-existence of Ukrainian language, and the key character is Taras Shevchenko. The next chapter is about the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the fact that Lenin or not Lenin invented Ukraine, as Vladimir Putin recently humorous said that. The last but one chapter is about Holodomor, and the last one is about Stepan Bandera, one of the most effective historical myths. And so actually the second part of the book is about the contemporary history of Russia and Ukraine. It's about the last 30 years, how all those myths were affecting Russian political situation, Ukrainian political situation, how all those myths were used. Just to not to sum up, but just to finish my long presentation, I'll tell you just a short anecdote about Stepan Bandera and about the story how Vladimir Putin for the first time learned about Stepan Bandera, and what was the source of his knowledge about Stepan Bandera, and why he's so sure that Bandera is the symbol of Nazi. I'm not sure if everyone in this room know the name Yulia Semyonov. That was so yes, some people know, but obviously not everyone. That was the most popular writer in the Soviet Union. It was altogether Ian Fleming, John Grisham, John le Carre. He has written the most popular novels about spies in Soviet Union, and his most famous novel is called 17 Moments of Spring, and there was a very well-known series based on that novel, and the main character is Shirlitz. He was a great Russian. His real name was Maxim Isayev. He was a Soviet spy who was spying on Nazi Germany, and he was the childhood hero of Vladimir Putin. Putin several times confessed in his interviews that he was so inspired while watching 17 Moments of Spring that he wanted to be a spy, he wanted to be a secret service agent, and after that, after reading so many novels of Yulia Semyonov and watching that series, he decided to go to KGB. So yes, it's important that as a teenager, as a student, he was reading every single novel written by Yulia Semyonov about Julius, and he had a lot. So the next novel after 17 Moments of Spring was called The Third Card, and that was the novel when where Stirlitz was fighting against Stepan Bandera. And there was the main villain of that novel that is completely forgotten by now. But it was very popular at that time, and it was one of the favorite books Vladimir Putin read as a student. And if we read all those descriptions of terrible Stepan Bandera written by and that's a fiction, obviously, written by Yulia Simonov, that's exactly the same what Vladimir Solovyov or Kisilov say about him. So that's obviously the primary source of inner knowledge that Vladimir Putin has about Ukrainian nationalists and Banderites. And we know that there is no better source of information than your inner knowledge. So that's how I can shortly describe my book. It has a lot of stories of how the stereotypes that are still working today were created, who created them, who created the myth that Russian and Ukrainian are the same people, how the myth that Ukrainian language does not exist was created, and so on and so forth and so forth. I will be happy to answer your questions if you have any.
Great. So we come to a Q&A session. And how would you like to do it? One by one or collectively?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
One by one.
Oh, wow, I'm first. Hi, my name is Sasha Soboleva. Thank you so much for coming, visiting us. So excited to read your book. My question is, how do you envision the decolonization of Russia after the fall of Putin's regime, whenever it comes, in whichever form?
That's a very straightforward question. Thank you. Yeah, I have a privilege. I'm a historian, not a politician. So I can afford myself just if I'm thinking about that, but not on a daily basis. But still, I think that it depends on when it's gonna happen, because we are changing all the time. Most of us had, or some of us had a very clear vision of what was going to happen to Russia right in the beginning of the war. A lot of people thought that that's a catastrophe, that's like the end of Russia. Russian Federation would fall apart, would be disintegrated. That's like the catastrophe of the idea of the current Russian state. And I think all those, for many people, that approach has changed for something different. Because on the course of war, those people who were who thought that the end is near, it's clear that they were wrong. I remember that in the beginning of like last March, I was in Berlin with a group of very well-known Russian editors-in-chief of different independent media, and we made bets. And the most optimistic bet was that Putin would go in July, meaning July 2022. So I think our approach is changing all the time. I remember the day when our predictions about what was going to happen changed every 6 hours. That was June 23rd. We did not expect anything to happen. Then Prigozhin's march towards Moscow started, and then it was over. And we changed our forecast, our vision for the Russia's future 3 times. Now the situation seems to be very complicated. Now, with the beginning of the Middle Eastern crisis that started on Putin's birthday, and it looks like the great birthday gift. Now now Putin can be happy because obviously the war in Ukraine is overshadowed for many people in this world by the Middle Eastern war, and for many months I was telling to my colleagues that Putin's strategy was just to do nothing and to sit and wait until the American presidential election, to wait for Trump to come back to the White House, and that was his strategy, because like he thought that the global chaos would save him. And actually, the global chaos started without Donald Trump in the White House. It's already there. So he's and if we're looking at the situation right now, the war is for years and years to come. And why I'm so long speaking about that? Because I think that the mentality of people in Russia is changing. Probably we've got our visions about how it should look like, but it will depend on the way how people in Russia would see themselves, would see Russia. We know probably that today majority of Russians are horrified. They are not actively supporting the war. They are hiding under the bed, pretending that nothing is happening. But they are going to change. So and we are going to change. So I guess that we will change number of times how we what meaning of the word decolonization we know. So I'll stop for now. Sorry for not answering the question.
That's the best answer we can find.
Thank you. My name is Sachin Yang. I do teach history here, but not the history of this region. My question, there are two. One, I've read various speeches by Putin on the Victory anniversary, and he made very specific references to events in World War II. So my question is this: what kind of help did he get from historians in Russia, including perhaps people in the Academy of Science? Does the name Alexander Chubaryan, for example, come up in your research? Do you have any insight? I mean, it's impossible that the president of Russian Federation doesn't go to the archive to do research himself. So is this just from his childhood reading of this spy novel, or there's something else that goes into it? The second question is about your book. I'm very glad that your book is about the history. We teach a course for graduate students at the LSU called The Issues of History in International Affairs, and Russia-Ukraine relation is very much a part of it. So what sources do you draw upon to, I guess, to borrow your word, decolonize Russians' view of history? I mean, unquestioned various issues, for example, Holodomor, as you're aware, even outside Russia, there are different historical interpretations as to what the purpose was Holodomor, was it? So how do you deal with even differences among historians outside Russia?
I think I'll start with the first question. It's easier. I recently written an op-ed for the New York Times exactly about that, about Putin's sources, about his historical knowledge, and about his ghostwriter. Because all of his articles about history are not written by him, are written by a person we know. His name is Vladimir Medinsky. He is former Minister of Culture, and he considers himself to be a historian as well. He has written a series of very fine books. The whole series is called Myths About Russia, and he's unveiling myths about Russian history. For example, he proves that Ivan the Terrible was not terrible. He was not cruel at all, and that's just a West European propaganda. And actually, all the rulers of that time in Western Europe were even more cruel, but they were envious, and that's why like they created the barbaric image of Ivan the Terrible. That's just one example of traditional Medinsky's approach to history. He's the person in charge of thinking facts for Putin. I think that the problem with we've got several problems with Putin's approach to Russian history. And the first problem that I've already mentioned, that the whole narrative we've got is only about unified empire, centralized empire. The whole history is focused on the figure of the leader, and is focused on the pride of violence. It's all about military victories, all about liberation of other countries, but actually which were invasions. So the narrative we have is already prepared for such imperialist approach, and but many of us during the last years I think we missed the point how Russian propaganda became obsessed with history during the last 10 years. Actually, that started approximately in 2012, but the obsession with history, especially with military history, like retrospectively, it's very clear. I lived in Russia all of those years, and now I try to remember, and I don't understand how I didn't notice that. How I didn't notice a huge mural on the wall right across the Kremlin with Dmitry Donskoy and Alexander Nevsky, two mighty Russian warriors, and it was visible. It was on the one of the main squares of Moscow, and all of those posters with the warriors, with soldiers, with the generals of the Great Patriotic War, they were everywhere. The militarization of Russian society was very visible. It was happening, and the propaganda of the war and importance of war, glorification of the army was visible. So we saw it, and actually Medinsky, as former Minister of Culture and also head of the organization, so-called Russian Military Historical Society. He was in charge of that ideological preparation for the war. I don't know much. Shuryan is 85. He has been appointed the director of Institute of History of Soviet Academy of Science back in 1972 or something like that. So he is in charge of Soviet history for 5 decades. So yes, it's still about the same Soviet history. It has never changed. And your second question was
your sources, the sources for your book, for example, these questions like a little bit more.
Yeah. First, I must underline the fact that the book consists of two parts, and the second part is mostly based on my own reporting, because or my own interviews. All the contemporary history starting after the collapse of Soviet Union. These are mostly my sources. I quote them openly. I've interviewed all of the Ukrainian presidents. I was covering as a journalist most important political events in Ukraine since 2003. So it's mostly based on my work. And we've got a lot of sources, a lot of reliable sources about the previous history. I deliberately start my book with 17th century, but not with Prince Vladimir, who baptized even Bruce, because I want reliable sources. We don't have enough reliable sources about Kievan Rus. We can write about Kievan Rus through the eyes of other historians. We know, for example, that the phrase Kievan Rus was invented in 19th century, and actually was not really used until academician Brekhov, the favorite historian of Stalin, the person who wrote the book named Kievan Rus. Actually, he used it as the name of the first state. And actually, people who lived in Kiev during Prince Vladimir, they didn't know that they lived in Kievan Rus. But since 17th century, we've got a lot of reliable sources. And if you speak about Holodomor, yeah, there are really different interpretations, but the Russian interpretation is that's not a denial. The traditional Russian approach to Holodomor is that okay, they were dying, but not only them. There was also a famine in Volga and in Volga region, and also famine in Kazakhstan, and Russians were also dead. So nothing special happened that time. But actually, we've got so we can come to those conclusions that nothing special happened if we read statistics, if we read just Wikipedia. But if we read Stalin's telegrams from his dacha in Sochi in summer of 1932, we see that there was a famine, and like it was not only about famine, it was about so-called executed Renaissance, the great purge of the biggest cultural figures of Ukraine that happened exactly the same time. So it was deliberate campaign, and it was a retaliation to the previous uprisings that happened in Ukraine. So it was not coincidence. It was not chaotic. It was planned, and we have enough documents to see, to read about this. So.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, for coming. My name is Mikhail. First of all, I wanted to say that I'm really happy that we have people from Russia come in with work on Russia and on the war in Ukraine, because in my opinion, that's as important as having Western academics and journalists write about it, because it comes from within, and for Russians to read it will be more kind of from their own perspective. It's easier to understand the writing when it comes from your own country. At least that's from my experience. And my question would be, what is the myth about Bandera? What is the myth about Bandera in your last chapter? What is the myth?
Thank you for the question. I must correct you a bit. Actually, my book is not about the current war. It's about the war that lasted for 3 centuries, but like it ends with February 24th. I haven't been to Ukraine after the full-scale aggression started, and I cannot write about that. So it's till the beginning of the aggression. And the myth of Bandera is very clear. It's very clear for everyone who's watching Russian television. That's like the vilified Ukrainian Nazi that hates Russia just because he hates Russia, and it has always been like that. And if we trace it historically, we would see that that phenomenon existed every time. So, but it only changed names. So before the Second World War, Banderites existed, but they were called Petlurites because of Simon Petlurin, who was considered to be the previous Bandera, the greatest enemy of Russia in Ukraine. But before before that, before 1917, they also existed. They were called Mazepoids because of Hetman Ivan Mazepa, who was the previous main enemy of Russian Empire. So that phenomena is never ending, and yes, that's very important.
Thank you for coming in to speak today. My question is, what's from your research and from your book, what can you say about the relationship between the Russian armed forces and the different militias that have been fighting in the Donbass since the 2014 start of the unrest? You know, these that are kind of on the far right scale of the spectrum. Are they a link of the state, or is it just a way for the Russian government to get rid of people it doesn't want on the streets of Russia, but that are still useful?
Yeah, that's very interesting story. You want the long story, which goes short. Kremlin was not prepared for so-called revolution of dignity in Ukraine. They were not prepared for Yanukovych to be overthrown, so that was a surprise. They had long plans. They had the scenario what to do. But they were thinking about after the second presidential term of Yanukovych, completely sure that Yanukovych was going to be re-elected, and they were thinking what to do if someday the Orange Revolution would be repeated. And actually, several times that was publicly revealed. In 2008. During the NATO summit in Bucharest, Putin was speaking to George W. Bush, and it was the moment when NATO had to decide to give membership action plan to Ukraine or not. And Putin said publicly, if Ukraine joins NATO, it will go there without Crimea and the East. So that we know that at least in 2008, there was such a speculation. So they had scenarios, but they were not prepared for 2014. So Crimea was spontaneous, but there was no real plan to occupy the East. So the Strelkov's terrorist group was not sent by Kremlin. It was sponsored by Konstantin Malofeev, the crazy Russian imperialist businessman who is affiliated with the state, but that was his own initiative. And of course, the person who was curator from Kremlin of that project, Vladislav Surkov, had a very interesting plan about that. He wanted them to die. He needed them to be martyrs for the next prepared campaign. So he didn't plan that Strelkov's group would capture Donetsk. He wanted them to be victims as glorified martyrs of Odessa. And actually, when Strelkov's group was still in Slovensk, he prohibited them from leaving the city. The Ukrainian army was surrounding Slovensk, and Surkov told Strelkov to stay there and to keep fighting and not to leave the city, because his idea was he wanted to see them dead as the heroes of the propaganda, of the fallen heroes. But actually, Strelkov disobeyed, left Slaviansk and went to Donetsk, and that was the whole different story. It was not part of the plan.
Thank you very much, Marat Ilyasov, George Zawodin, University visiting scholar here. I am Chechen, and for Chechens, same as for many other Soviet, post-Soviet people, pre-Soviet people, the necessity of decolonization of history was always long before full-scale invasion in Ukraine, long before the dissolution of Soviet Union, long before even the creation of Soviet Union. So my question is for you, and it's based on your previous answer. As it took quite long for you to understand and realize this necessity, right? And you are not an ordinary man. You are not. You're quite exceptional man for Russian pool. So why do you think that others will go the same path? Why they will not fall into the trap of propaganda? Why they will not believe in the great myth of Russian history as they did before? It's much easier to believe in this, and it's much more pleasant, is it not?
I won't criticize your first point that you have already known it even before you were born. But yeah, it's different for different people. Some people understand that decolonization is important. Some people prefer not to understand. Some even some Chechens probably think that that it's better being a part of Russia is better. Some Ukrainians they are called Belarusians now in Ukraine. Those people who came to Moscow and who don't speak Ukrainian and think that Ukraine should be part of Russia. And we know that actually a lot of people in Putin's inner circle of the blood. The person who is considered the mastermind of this war, Yuri Volchuk, he's of Ukrainian origin. Dmitry Kozak, who was Russian negotiator, was born in Kirovgrad. A lot of them are Ukrainians, and they would fight for the idea against decolonization of Russia. And that's always happening. That's happening not only in Russia. You know that Russia is not the only empire that has that problems. And the only problem is that Russia didn't start that conversation till now. British Empire started that conversation about 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, Kipling was considered to be not really a decent thinker, and people denouncing him for his infamous point about white man's burden. It was like it started 100 years ago. So that intellectual work of decolonization of British history started many years ago, but it doesn't mean that it has always been very successful. Decolonization of French Empire is different. If we come to Paris and would visit the French Military Museum that is located right next to the grave of Napoleon, there is a huge exhibition about French Empire and Napoleon, and literally it's written there everywhere that Napoleon was the great unifier of Europe. Actually, he was spiritual predecessor of European Union, and those treacherous foreigners betrayed him and the idea of European unity. So it's the most imperialist museum that I've been to. So there is like the French work on the decolonization of the French history is not that successful. So it happens with different nations and with different empires. It's always very painful. We have to try probably. I would repeat that conversation in Russia hasn't started yet. I think that we are right now starting to speak about that. Actually today is a very important day for me because today is the publication day of this book in Russian. It's not going to be distributed physically inside the country, but together with Medusa, we invented some kind of digital some stuff. It's going to be published on the Medusa's application. So anyone who lives in Russia and cannot pay for the book because Visa and MasterCard don't work there, Kindle, Amazon don't accept Russian words, but so people who live in Russia would be able to read it for free on those applications. So actually, starting this day, I would get a lot of hatred in my direct messages in social media, and but I will learn something. I will learn what is the reception, what is the reaction of the Russian audience to that conversation. So I think we are just in the beginning. And I'm not extremely optimistic. I think we need decades.
Thank you very much. Jill Doherty from Georgetown University. It's great to see you, Mikhail, and thank you. You know, we're talking about kind of bigger ideas, decolonization, et cetera. But when I look at the front of your book, which I have not completed, I've started, I see the pictures of two men. And you have, you know, the subtitle is Putin, Zelensky, and the Path. So could you go into what role do these two men play? You know, what is the dynamic and the influence of those two men in what you're talking about?
First, that's American market. There are two versions. Of this book printed in English, and there is another British publisher. So if I'm going to show you the version of this book printed in Britain, and it's so different. Oh. That's incoming from China. So I don't know if it's visible for anyone. But that's
Oh my God, it's completely different.
It's completely different cover, completely different cover, and completely different picture, and the subtitle is different. So for UK, subtitle is different. That's the market. You know, Ashat in Britain and Simon & Schuster in America are two different publishers. Read it the subtitle.
Yes.
Yeah. The British subtitle is War and Punishment: The Story of Russian Oppression and Ukrainian Resistance. Second one. Yeah. This one. Yeah,
So they don't have any role.
that's public information. I'm not revealing any secret. Yeah, but and I will tell you more. The structure of the book published in Russian and in English are different, because in Russian it's 7 chapters, and it's. Every chapter has combined description, myth, and then how it's working right now. But the English version has historical chapters and then contemporary political situation, because my American editor, publisher, told me, you've got Potemkin and Brezhnev in the same chapter. You should do it chronologically. No one would understand anything. I was mad for about a week, but then I realized that maybe he's right. Maybe I should do it chronologically, not to confuse with anyone with 17th century, because the fact that I started in 17th century just was a scam. But still, to defend my American publisher, I must say that yes, Vladimir Zelensky is very important, probably the most important character of this book, because the contemporary story it's not only about political situation, it's also a story of his life. And it starts actually with his birth. And I tell the story of his career as stand-up comedian. I talked to his childhood friends and his friends who played comedy with him. That's the most popular comedy show on Soviet and then Russian television. And I have the story about his humor and how his humor changed over the last 20 years. the jokes he could afford back 20 years ago are completely inappropriate for this day. So he changed a lot. The way how it was possible to joke 20 years ago is different. The way how Ukrainian society changed and how Russian society changed, how perception of ourselves changed during the last 20 years it's visible when we're just watching the story of that person who and like his story is very symbolic. He was the star of KVN on Russian television, and he lived in Moscow. And then he decided to quit and to come back to Kiev. And that was 2003, 2004. That was before the Orange Revolution. But that was just here. But that was the coincidence. He decided to stop being Russian and to become Ukrainian. And that happened at the same time when actually that psychological shift in Ukraine did happen. So it's very important to show how that cultural transformation of Ukrainian society was happening, and his example is very symbolic, and it's also very symbolic if we speak about it's important if we speak about American cover that in Ukraine Ukrainians have these three generations of post-Soviet politicians. The first generation was communist, and two first presidents were active members of the Communist Party, people who were prominent members of the Communist Party. Kravchuk was the first secretary, Kuchma was the member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Then the next generation was Komsomol generation. Yushchenko and Timoshenko and Poroshenko were like spent most of their lives in the Soviet Union. They were prominent in Komsomol. And Zelensky represents the next generation. He didn't spend most of his life in Soviet Union. Most of his life is after the collapse of Soviet Union. He doesn't have that Soviet mentality. And that's a huge contrast because in Russia, there is still the first generation. People who are in power now are still the first communist generation. Majority of Putin's life, he lived in Soviet Union. He was a member of this one.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Svetlana Savranskaya. I work at the National Security Archive here at GW. I loved your book on the Kremlin men. I assigned it in my classes. And here in this book, I really enjoyed the part, especially from the invasion of Crimea to the end. And you know what struck me is something that you just talked about, but I would like to ask a little deeper about it. So the book talks about the oppression and resistance, but in this, in the last two, I think 3 chapters, what comes out, what is striking, you would expect this immense pushback and resistance, but there's a lot of cooperation. You can see the oligarchs talking to each other and Poroshenko making deals with the Russians, and certainly even Zelensky going to Russia and filming the 2 films, The Servant of the People, and the other one, I forget exactly the name. But so there is this subterranean and sometimes obvious effort to live together. And you know what? I want to understand it better. How is it that after Crimea, there is still this thickness of ties, and some of them are successful, some of them are not, like the Minsk agreement. When I watched The Servant of the People, again, what struck me is it's completely not anti-Russian. They make jokes about Putin, and some of them are biting jokes, but they're not violent jokes, you know. there's much more of a criticism of themselves and the European Union. And Putin, when he is presented as this, really kind of funny and awkward guy, but not as a threatening enemy. When I watched it, I couldn't believe that this tone still existed at that time. I completely missed it. I missed the accommodating, accepting tone in the Ukrainian society after the invasion of Crimea. Even though I do have family in Ukraine and we visited many times after the invasion, but there was still this ability to work together, some willingness to cooperate. Can you explain that?
I think it's natural. It's hard to explain that for me because I'm not Ukrainian and I didn't live in Ukraine. I can tell you that what's happening in Russia was even more striking because in Russia, Crimea and Ukraine were completely forgotten. Like nothing has happened, and people were surprised. Like in 2015, was there a problem? And I remember, for example, perfectly well how astonished I was in January 2021 when they restarted anti-Ukrainian propaganda campaigns. When it was like I remember the beginning, and I described it in the book. It was almost the same day as the trial of Alexei Navalny. They obviously wanted to switch attention, and Margaret Simonyan went to Donbass. And there was a huge show, and she made her legendary speech. Mother Russia, take Donbass back home. Россия матушка. And that was so surprising because like there was no conversation about that. They had to like what was really hard to restart that engine again because like that propaganda stopped. And if we speak about Ukraine, it's natural actually. It takes a lot of effort to produce hate, and sometimes it's happening, and we know countries unified by hatred. And we know countries where the hatred was the main national idea for years. But it's really hard. It's really exhausting. It's energy consuming. And as we know from Ukrainian history, almost every Ukrainian president was elected as president of peace, or even pro-Russian president. And then during the course of his presidency, he has become anti-Russian. And then another pro-Russian president was elected, and then he has become anti-Russian. Then another, and it happened with everyone. Poroshenko was the most pro-Russian candidate among after Euromaidan. He was considered to be president of peace, unlike Klitschko, Takhnibok, or other Maidan leaders. He was candidate of peace. He was mainly elected because the voters saw that he was so close to Russia. He had so much experience. He would negotiate peace. Then he had become the president of war, and the president of peace, the candidate of peace was elected. So obviously, yes, Zelensky was viewed as pro-Russian candidate, the most interesting for me at least. Story about the people is that actually when I listened to the stories of their first days, first months of Zelensky's team, when they tell those stories, I don't really understand if they confuse the film with the reality, because it's all the same. It's just exactly everything what was shown in the film. They had the same problems. They didn't know. They needed to make a party and candidates to run for parliamentary elections, and they did have to. And they were like classmates of classmates of. It was the same story is. But the most interesting, like there is one huge difference between the real life and the series. Series is in Russian. Every single word Zelensky says as Ukrainian president in film, he says in Russian.
Only in the first
Even his speech as the president in the Rada during his inauguration day, he says in Russian. And in reality, it was other way around.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but we have a reception out there where we can continue the conversation. And the last question will come from our online audience. Dear Mikhail, thank you for writing this timely book. How do you envision your own future as an independent journalist exiled from Russia?
I envision my future as independent. And writer. Mostly because I've got so many books to write. I'm going to finish my next book finally about the collapse of Soviet Union. I'm writing it for 7 years already, and I had to stop because I had to write this book. But for many years I've been interviewing. I was writing non-Moscow centered history of the collapse of Soviet Union. I was touring before this aggression to different. And actually, that was my initial aim to come to Kiev back in 2021. I needed to interview Kravchuk and Yuri Yukhnovsky and Stepan Khmara, all those great veterans of Ukrainian independence movement. First president. I visited all other capitals, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia. I was interviewing all first presidents, last first secretaries, leaders of the opposition of late 80s. So I've got thousands of interviews and like a lot of work is done. So I have to finish this book. I hope that, and I'm lucky that that I have a lot of time, and that I, for example, didn't sign the contract about this book 2 years ago. Because 2 years ago, when I was talking to different publishers, they were telling me, "Collapse of Soviet Union? Who cares about that?" And now they say, "Oh yes, this is collapse. This is this is bloody the second phase of the collapse of Soviet Union." Exactly, that was exactly what I'm writing on. So I've got a lot of work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.